girl, Ho'okulani. Be patient. Your turn will come. Ho'okulani grew up to be a beautiful, fine young lady.
Every summer at the Smithsonian Institution's Festival of American Folklife,
The whites with this generosity.
master storytellers share the lore from their cultures.
Tout à l'heure, le mort a commencé à se lever.
Stories from hundreds of cultures, told in 1,000 languages, living and dead.
So
Evolved from a common impulse,
rises up over
the search for meaning.
We don't whistle when people are dead.
Because the story should
For where we come from.
There was a grandfather's clock in the dining room.
For who we are.
Decided to take a cotton sack, which...
And why we're here in a universe so much larger than ourselves.
He filled it up with his money, slung it across his back, and headed with his 10 children to 4 miles north of Boulder, Oklahoma, the all-black town I was telling you about.
From a few fragments of bone, a story asks to be told. The meticulous examination of fossil evidence to recreate past eons. What face fleshed this skull? Questions, some without definitive answers. Paleoanthropology finds itself perched on the edge of myth.
Based on a few scraps of bone, a few sediments, a few pieces of pollen, you can actually tell a story.
Meg Conkey, anthropologist, University of California, Berkeley.
You can give the people who left all of these things aspirations, hopes, fears, problems, conflicts, and confrontations. You can make them a part of the long scope of human history.
There's much more myth-making in the study of human fossils for two obvious reasons. One is that it matters more to us because it's about ourselves, so we tend to tell legends because we seek solace in stories about ourselves. We don't care that much about worms.
Stephen J. Gould, biologist, geologist, historian of science, Harvard.
The second reason is we don't know a lot about human evolution because the fossil record isn't very good, so there's less empirical constraint on myth-making.
I wish there was some word to use in talking about myth in human evolution besides the word myth, because the word myth has come to have the unfortunate connotation of a false story, a misunderstanding, and a superstition of antique origin.
Matt Cartmill, anthropologist, Duke University.
We tell stories about the evolution of human beings and razorback clams and impala and all the other animals and plants in the world because we're interested in trying to make the world explicable. Okay? This is one of the things that science is supposed to do for us, is to make the world intelligible.
Creation myth, an ever-branching elaboration of oral and written literature. Adam and Eve. And now scientific explorations of the human past.
Man's uniqueness or present position of dominance can be traced to the unique situation of his birth, the unique and special circumstances of his birth.
Misia Landau, an anthropologist at Boston University, studies the parallels between science-based explanations for human evolution and folktales and myths.
Your basic hero story takes the following form. A hero leaves home, is confronted by a series of obstacles and challenges, and finally overcomes those and triumphs. Same is true of theories of human evolution. You start off with an ape leaves the trees, is confronted by a series of terrestrial foes and dangers. And it's by overcoming these dangers, by responding to these dangers, for example, by developing a large brain or the bipedal position, that he actually becomes a human. And the point is that the hero's success is a foregone conclusion. From the start of the tale, you know what's going to happen at the end. The hero is going to become a hero, so to speak. There is a sense of inevitability to a hero story. Same thing with theories of human evolution. There's a sense of inevitability.
And of course, if you stop and think about it really hard, Don't even have to think very hard about it. That's not true. There are lots of unlikely events that happen in human evolution.
David Pilbeam, anthropologist, Harvard.
And what has happened wasn't in any sense of the word inevitable.
Because humans arose geologically a fraction of a metaphorical second ago with respect to geological time, that tiny little space of time that we occupy in the history of the Earth makes it appear, and indeed I think that's correct, that we're sort of an unpredictable, accidental latecomer.
Science is continually taking humans out of the center role. The sun no longer revolves around the Earth.
Rick Potts, paleoanthropologist, director of the Human Origins Program at the Smithsonian.
We're on one insignificant arm of the Milky Way galaxy out of many galaxies that are there. And even within the evolutionary realm of study, that humans are not at the top of the natural world.
The Darwinian story of human evolution still stands today, the baseline scenario of paleoanthropology.
He developed a theory in which there was no higher order harmony, that if the universe and the world of life consists of adaptation and harmony within ecosystems, it's all a side consequence of organisms struggling for personal reproductive success. That's a very hard kind of argument to get into our souls. It's probably correct. So if anything, Darwin was a philosophical radical. Now, he was not a personal radical. He was a country squire living in his little house in Down. In many ways, it's probably one of the most remarkable things about him, that by leading a rather conventional life, he was able to gain the philosophical freedom to be one of the most radical thinkers in history.
Darwin wrote The Descent of Man, in some sense, to bring man down to earth. And so he appeals to both our pride and our humility. And I think this is beautifully captured in the last passage, the final, the culminating passage of The Descent of Man, which reads as follows. We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy, which feels for the most debased, with benevolence, which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin.
The Galapagos Islands, an isolated volcanic archipelago off the Ecuadorian coast. Here, separated from continental genetic influences for millennia, species unique to the islands have evolved. More than a century and a half after Darwin's brief sojourn in the Galapagos, novelist Kurt Vonnegut visits the same islands and is inspired to use Darwin's theory in the service of his own ironic vision of natural selection.
I wondered what would happen if animals as impractical as we are were stuck there. After all, they're penguins. They're stuck there right on the equator, can you imagine? And they've survived. And there are all these finches which have no business out there at all, and they're living on lava with almost nothing to eat. They belong in woodlands and meadows and all that. They made it out there, and so I said, okay, so let's strand some human beings out there and leave them for 1,000,000 years.
In his novel Galapagos, the human race is invaded by a virus that renders reproduction impossible. In the 1980s, humankind becomes extinct, except for an eccentric band of virus-free survivors trapped in the Galapagos. As this handful of survivors reproduce, evolution takes a baffling and, for Vonnegut, inspired turn. Humankind survives by evolving into seals.
This idea offended a lot of reviewers. who said there is no such thing as devolution, as our nature. We're headed only in the direction of improvement, always improvement.
The book's narrator, a misfit ghost, observes the demise of contemporary man from 1,000,000 years hence.
Even at this late date, I am still full of rage at a natural order which would have permitted the evolution of something so distracting and irrelevant and disruptive as those great big brains of 1,000,000 years ago. Part of the vanity of the human race is that because we produced a Mozart or a Darwin or a Shakespeare or an Einstein, that we ourselves are almost that smart, and we're not. People that smart are a great rarity. On the basis of World War I, World War II, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, the big brain is destructive and not helpful. If God is a God of love and innocence and all that, the best way to serve him, I would think, would be as a seal.
Gazing on the inhabitants of these tiny islands once planted the seeds for the story of evolution in Charles Darwin's mind. Now Darwin's extraordinary insights are the basis for a writer's sardonic vision of humankind's escape from its magnificently evolved brain.
It's storytelling, and that's all any of us can do anyway, is tell a plausible story and to tell the most truthful story we can. 1,000,000 years later, I feel like apologizing for the human race.
One of the most mysterious and baffling things about human beings is the way their hair grows. And do you know any other mammal, I don't, that unless it cuts its hair periodically by hacking at it with sharpened rocks or something, grows a curtain of hair in the males that goes down and obscures the mouth. So the hair has to be pushed out of the way in order to feed. Or that in both sexes grows a curtain of hair that falls down over the eyes. I mean, we've bred weird domestic animals that have these kinds of deformities. Why we should have them is mysterious. But that's not the sort of thing that people are interested in explaining when we talk about explanatory stories of human evolution. The sorts of features that are stressed are things like large brains and upright posture and language and technology, grasping hands, social organization, things that are supposed to explain and to some extent justify human dominion over nature.
Raymond Dart, Australian neuroanatomist. Born 1893, he comes of age during World War I. In 1924, he is presented with a skull discovered in a lime quarry in Tong, South Africa. A small skull, a juvenile, face intact. The Tong child had lived 1 to 2 million years before. Dart sees humanity in the skull and fulfillment of Darwin's prediction that the first humans had evolved in Africa. He names his ape hominid child Australopithecus africanus, southern ape of Africa.
Sometimes you find a discovery that as soon as you see it, you know that it's something different and new and something that might contradict an idea, a hunch that someone has proposed.
And indeed, Australopithecus was read out of the human ancestry for a long time because it had a small brain, and the enlarged brain was expected to be the hallmark of a human ancestor. But we now have very sound reasons for believing that our ancestors were up on their hind legs while they still had essentially ape-like brains and heads and faces. And that rules out a lot of the stories that we can tell. It blows a lot of the stories that have been told into the trash can.
But the stories that had perpetuated one bias, the importance of the large brain, would, over the course of 3 decades, give way to other stories.
What Raymond Dart did was to take a set of bones in a cave site in southern Africa and say that, well, these are all broken up and they're associated with the fossil bones of early humans, and this means meat eating, and that means you have to kill in order to get that kind of food, and that means that they must have been aggressive, and then it becomes from there all developed in a whole cultural context, and part of that cultural context is humans are innately aggressive. That apparently is the one which Raymond Dart preferred to emphasize.
Really, if you look back at it, you see Raymond Dart sitting there with the material from Tom. He's got one skull of a baby ape, and he's got a bunch of other bones of other things. And he says, well, of course, the baby ape's grown-up relatives killed all the other things. Why?
Dart postulated that the upright stance of Australopithecus had freed the hands for tools to kill.
Man's ancestors had been, quote, confirmed killers, carnivorous creatures that seized living quarries by violence, battered them to death, tore apart their broken bodies, dismembered them limb from limb, slaking their ravenous thirst with the hot blood of victims and greedily devouring livid, writhing flesh. Unquote. And this is not the objective language of someone who's interested in Australopithecine ecology.
Raymond Dart actually goes ahead and puts the mark of Cain on our ancestors. He refers to the meat-eating habit as the mark, quote, the mark of Cain that separates man from his anthropoidal relatives and allies him with the deadliest of carnivora.
One can take what Darwin said and make it into a competitive and dangerous process. And in essence, that's what Raymond Dart did.
Others interpreted the same fossil evidence far differently from Dart. Perhaps early hominids had delayed food eating, which would suggest sharing, cooperation, organization.
All of a sudden, the bony evidence of a ravenous carnivorous ape becomes a different picture, one of cooperative food sharing, and it gives a very, very different, couches our understanding of early humans in a very, very different light. These are all hunches with a long philosophical tradition, and the question is that understanding that these traditions exist, understanding literature, understanding philosophy, understanding that these ideas have cropped up in our philosophies before there was ever fossil evidence is very important.
Although Dart's vision of the killer ape has been repudiated, the diminutive skull of Australopithecus africanus has almost universally been accepted as hominid, a true ancestor of humankind.
My favorite example of evolution in process is what might be called the Australopithecine body, that you have this agglomeration of traits that you don't find in any living creature today, neither human nor ape. You have an ape-sized brain and a head that looks sort of in ape proportions, but on a body which is walking upright. This combination of features that we don't see today is, to me, some of the best evidence that evolution has taken place.
Humankind defines and redefines itself. Anthropologists look for hard evidence, for the objective vision, but the terms of objectivity evolve, making it difficult to avoid the cultural and technological biases of the times.
Until this generation, almost all science in the West was done by wealthy white males, so you didn't even have a plurality of biases. You just had the bias of this one tiny little group of upper-class white men who were doing all the science.
When we look at the reconstructions, the earlier forms have attributes of other races and even, of course, of other kinds of primates, such as apes. It's always interesting to see what the result of human evolution is. It's not women, and it's not any other race besides whites.
From the mid-50s through the 1970s, the man-the-hunter view of human evolution was the prevailing inference of paleoanthropology.
It was men who were able to hunt that actually set us on the course of human evolution, that made humans what we are, that allowed us to colonize the globe, to move into northerly latitudes, to begin to move to the top of the food chain, and all of these other kinds of things that we associate with our success and accomplishments. The idea is that it was hunting.
And that naturally, it was the males that were doing the hunting. It enabled the females to devote more and more of their time to the business of raising children. As one anthropologist put it, from the very beginning of human evolution, he said, the male specialized as hunter, the female as domestic.
And man developed language, and I use man in the sense of male. Man developed language in order to hunt, developed symbolic capacities in order to do this, and of course this accounts for only 50% of the human race.
If you like, it's sort of the Flintstone model of human evolution. The domestic arrangements of the 1950s read back into prehistory. In this case, as causally important for the emergence of humanity from an ape-like ancestry. Now, to say that is not to say that this wasn't true or that it wasn't important. But it seems to me that it's incumbent on us, if we're going to try to say things about what happened in the past, to talk about things that have some chance of being tested.
18,000 years ago, glaciers ebb and flow. Caverns are carved from underground rivers which flood and empty. A race of modern humans has already emerged, thought to have evolved from African peoples who had begun a northward migration about 80,000 years before. They inhabit and sanctify caves throughout what will become southern Europe. In the early 1900s, 3 massive linked caves are discovered by the Beguin family on their farmland in southern France. Jean Clottes, director of antiquities of the Middle Pyrenees, oversees the 13-year-long excavation of the cave called Onlen. The people who lived here were called the Magdalenians. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers and undoubtedly tellers of stories in a fully developed language. Hundreds of meters into the cave, a Magdalenian living space is meticulously combed for fragments of lives long past.
What we do is trying to reconstruct how those people lived. For example, the hearths, when they made those hearths and the burnt bones. Here, I can very well imagine the smoke that must have been maybe 1 meter from the ground, and the smells, which we have no idea of. We can imagine the smells that must have permeated this deep chamber. The cave here in this particular chamber is full of cracks, and in many of those cracks there are bones that were stuck forcibly down those cracks, and they are at all sorts of heights. This is a Magdalene Gesture. It has been done willfully, so of course we can't help wondering what happened. Why did they do this? When you find, for example, a pendant which is half perforated, you can see exactly how the man worked, what were his gestures, so you feel close to them. They were people like us. 15,000 years ago is not so long.
The National Museum of Prehistory at Les Aisies, once a 13th century fortress, now a sanctuary of the Magdalenian legacy.
They surely told stories about their lives. their hopes, their aspirations, their neighbors, their enemies. We all create ourselves through the process of writing and creating stories. I wonder how close my stories are to their stories. Maybe we are linked to the past in ways that we don't realize it, telling stories about people who told stories to get through life the same way we tell stories to get through life.
Lascaux is like some work of art by Michelangelo. It's something unique. It stands out among the other keys. And that poses a problem. Why should it stand out like that? Maybe the originality of Lascaux is not something extremely profound, but is the originality of Picasso or any other great artist like that a sorcerer?
The people who painted the caves of Lascaux were us. There hasn't been any anatomical modification, no increase in brain size. Human beings have built everything that we call civilization with unchanged biology. I think we have all the capacity for destruction or beneficence that we're ever going to need.
In the 1940s, poet Robinson Jeffers expressed both revulsion and bitter sympathy for the human animal. In his poem titled Original Sin, Jeffers uses the killing of a mammoth as a symbol of who and what humankind is.
They go and get burning brands of wood from their fire back at the cave, and they cook the mammoth alive. And he concludes the poem with these lines. These are the people. This is the human dawn. As for me, I would rather be a worm in a wild apple than a son of man. But we are what we are. And we might remember not to hate any person, for all are vicious, and not be astonished at any evil. All are deserved, and not fear death. It is the only way to be cleansed.
It matter. Human beings in the past have acted in ways that we think are absolutely reprehensible and tragic. They've also acted in ways that we think are kind. They've created works of art that stun us. They've created episodes of destruction that horrify us. What can it teach us except we know that people can do all these things? It doesn't help us to say what's good and what's bad.
In the long run, the questions that paleoanthropologists are in the business of answering, I think, cannot be answered without some myth-making involved. The two basic questions, what does it mean to be human and how we got to be that way, which are at the heart of the field, are questions that I don't believe can be answered fully in a purely objective and scientific way. And so the question is whether or not scientists are prepared to make those myths. And the question I ask is, if they don't tell the stories, who else will?
This scientific endeavor, even though it's also a cultural endeavor and involves communication through stories, it is also an endeavor of skepticism. And that's how the hunches, the guesses, including ones that are imbued in culture, and in that context, can ultimately be doubted.
There is a factual state of the world. It's very hard to figure out what it is, and we'll never know all of it by any means. But that is distinct from myth-making. Now, the two, because people are what they are, they're creatures embedded in cultures, the two often coincide, but sorting them out is very important.